And I'm particularly gratified that so many of you have decided to attend a session with such an obscure title. Why would anybody think to talk about manufacturing principles at a government conference? Was everybody here, or a lot of people here at Kevin Bowling's presentation that I was in? Anybody who wasn't, because I'll just leave aside, my bio is in there. I'm Jeff Barlow. I lost my name tag. I can never keep them. But basically my background was 10 years as a lawyer, then got a computer science degree, got an MBA along the way, project management, worked for the Oregon courts for 25 or 30 years, depending on how you count it. Consult now for ImageSoft. Absolutely love it. Drives my wife crazy. Am really pleased to be here because I'm probably obscenely passionate about the whole thing about not so much technology. As a technology, I'm really sort of a fraud. I know just enough to talk dirty. I'm multilingual. I speak techie, I speak lawyer, I speak project management, I speak the business side. But what I like to do is, my little dirty secret is, I like to see things work, and I like to see them be useful. And so I managed to parlay that into a very fun career, and enjoyed every second of it. In the early 1990s, I was a systems analyst and project manager for the Oregon Judicial Department. At the time, I was going through an executive MBA program, which, if you don't know, is one of these things where you basically work full-time, then you go to school, and then you could pick one of any three. You can eat, you could sleep, you could say hi to your family, pick one. But interestingly, at that time, there was very little, if any, of the material in the MBA programs dealt with the service sector, much less the public sector. Now, fortunately, that's changed. Back then, everything was manufacturing. So it was that it was in our course on manufacturing strategy that I first learned of Taiichi Ono of Toyota Manufacturing. Taiichi Ono is credited with developing the Toyota manufacturing system. He did it in post-World War II in the 50s and 60s. I believed, I listened to this stuff and I said, man, this is what we do in courts. What he was talking about with the manufacturing cars. This talk that I'm giving now is based on a series of blog articles that I wrote. I write a blog. Hopefully you'll all go read it. Order in the Court. You can Google Jeff Barlow Order in the Court, or I think we have it I think I have it on the last slide. You can go read the blog articles in the original Geek, and that's what this presentation is based on. Let's see if I can operate this. Let me begin by saying there's a lot more to this topic than we have time to cover, and anyone who's interested in more information or discussing the topics further, please get a hold of me or any one of the ImageSoft folks. So this afternoon I want to cover at a high level, why does this matter to courts? Why does this stuff matter to courts, and what is waste, and specifically why are we talking about these particular 7? What causes them, how to recognize them, common court examples, and what electronic content management can do to help alleviate their effects. Now, I'm cognizant that probably how many folks here have got some form of ECM in their courts at this time? Very few. Oh, or you're just all asleep. The answer. Okay. Well, for those who do, one of the things that happens as you put it in is you tend not to think about a lot of the things till later on, and then you can start looking around and saying, boy, we could actually use this to solve these problems that we weren't thinking about in the first instance. So you can keep that in mind as we go. So in the early 1990s, Toyota was selling cars in the US for substantially less than it cost American companies to make the vehicles, much less to ship them overseas and sell them for what they cost, much less for any profit. So the Americans at that time felt that Toyota was dumping its cars, selling them under cost in order to build up their market share, which would be illegal and in violation of a bunch of treaties and stuff like that. Toyota really vigorously denied that, and they invited a delegation of American manufacturers and trade reps, to go and take a look at Toyota's operation. Now, I've gone ahead and drawn a very rough, probably inaccurate approximation of the classic American auto manufacturing plant circa anywhere from Henry Ford up through the early 1990s. Keep in mind that I don't know a thing about auto manufacturing, but this is very high level. Now, from left to right, we have the parts and supplies are delivered by the suppliers to the factory. They're put in warehouses and storage. The supplies are then moved in batches to temporary storage near the assembly line, where they're consumed as they're needed during the assembly line process. And as pieces or parts are assembled or made ready for the next step, they're stored nearby so they can be ready when the next step's ready for them. Once the vehicle's completed, then it moves to some form of quality control, probably has its own storage area. I didn't put any detail in here. Defects are routed to another entire different process, which I just symbolized here as a barrel or maybe subliminally a trash can. And then the non-defective completed vehicles are moved to a storage lot where they wait for being moved, transport, once they get orders from the dealership. And finally, then they're loaded in batches onto large trucks and trains and shipped to the dealer's lot, where they sit until they're sold. So that was the standard American model at the time, at very high level. When the American delegation got to Japan and observed Toyota's assembly line, which is the green box in the middle, on the surface it looked pretty much like the American counterparts. The machines were the same, they had Japanese labels, but okay. There were approximately the same number of stations, and the workers at the stations were doing approximately the same things. And at first blush, it sure looked like it was taking about the same amount of time and effort to build a Toyota as it took to build American cars. Now, as we'll see as we go through, there are in fact a number of major differences, and they're right out here in plain sight. But overlay it onto a very high-level look at court processing. And in some sense, the court processing, this is what I was thinking as I was sitting there in the 1990s. This is very similar to the kind of things that courts tend to do. Documents come in from the outside. They're pulled, they're assembled and stored in a file room. When they're needed for court sessions, they're pulled and sent to the court, where they're stacked nearby until they're needed for the proceeding. And as the hearing on each case is completed, the files and documents, including those produced in the proceedings, are stacked up until they can later be transported to the next step. When the proceeding's done, the files usually are sent to someone who assembles everything and checks to make sure it's all correct. And again, defects go into their own particular processes. Excuse me. The non-defects go out to out baskets, where they're ultimately filed, sent out, and so on. And then the files ultimately are returned to the file room. Now, I'm not trying to create a close analogy to the auto plant here, but trying to illustrate some basic principles that are common to both manufacturing and court operations. Because I think in applying these principles to auto manufacturing, Toiichi Ohno didn't focus on changing the basic attributes of the product that Toyota was producing. For Toyota, it was cars. For courts, it's judicial outcomes. But instead, he was focusing on managing the processes by which the products are developed, produced, and delivered. Toyota didn't attempt to produce different cars, and courts, generally speaking, aren't attempting to alter the forms and types of standard judicial outcomes. What he did was make the processes themselves strategic, meaning that Toyota strove to produce the same types of vehicles at less cost and with higher quality. So Toiichi Ohno defined in his book, the Toyota Production System, value. His definition of value is something that the customer is willing to pay for. Toyota's customers are willing to pay for cars. They're not willing to pay for moving them from Japan to the United States. They're not willing to pay for storing the parts or recycling the defects. Cars are what have values. Tires have values. Engines have a value. People will pay more for a better engine. They will not pay more for better parts storage. Now, I think that while something that they're willing to pay for is generally also true for the justice system, even more specifically, I think we could say something that advances or supports justice. And in either event, if the definition is there's something that a customer is willing to pay for, then also almost axiomatically, the definition for waste is, would somebody pay for this activity? And if the answer is not yes, then the activity is a waste, in that if the outcome or product can be produced without it, the customer wouldn't miss it. Likewise, for courts, would litigants miss judicial impartiality, procedural fairness, or legal correctness in a court determination? Absolutely. Those are the value-added pieces. Would they care whether a file is retrieved from central file storage, carried to a judge maybe in a different building, then returned in a timely and accurate manner to the storage? No, they don't care about that. It may be totally necessary in order to have your hearing and get your determination, but it's, those functions are of no value to the court users. And so anything that you do beyond what's absolutely necessary there is a waste. And because court operations and processes are so document intensive, document management systems have to be a central focus of court efforts to identify and eliminate waste. So that's where I'm focusing this talk. Now you'll note that the title of this presentation was not 7 wastes, like we took the first 7 or the most interesting 7. It's the 7 wastes, and that's not an accident. Taiichi Ohno identified 7 specific types of waste that have to be managed, and every one of them lurk in court records management processes. So if you can't remember the names of the 7 wastes, well, this is in mnemonic for Tim Wood. So meet Tim Wood. Transportation, inventory, motion, waiting, overprocessing, overproduction, and defects. And while you may have trouble remembering their names, you work with them every day. So let's take a look at them one by one. Returning to our high-level overview of the court process, the arrows represent transportation. And obviously, these aren't the only instances of transportation, but they provide some pretty good examples. The red arrows represent those that are internal to the court. So we see moving files from the file room to the waiting area. Now, what doesn't show, but there should, is moving the files from the waiting area specifically to the bench or whatever. Then we see the documents and files moving out of the hearings area into the subsequent processing. And notice that if we were talking about the justice system as a whole, these arrows also would be red, but since I'm just dealing with courts, it's however it comes in. But this is e-filing, like we get that there. By implementing electronic content management with electronic document management with appropriate workflow, routine document and file transportation can be almost, if not completely, controlled and accomplished using configurable workflow. Based on the court's rules and practices. Non-routine transportation, like consider the judges on the bench. Oh, we need that other file. Well, that didn't come up with the batch, so that's sort of non-routine. With ECM, that can be accomplished in seconds, and you don't have to have staff being interrupted and tasked with going and fetching it. There are a lot of ways in courts to attack and eliminate the waste of transportation. Remote video hearings, location of the court in close proximity to frequent participants, like having juvenile hearings at the juvenile center, for instance, are a few non-document-centric examples. But interestingly, implementing them gives rise, even greater rise to the need for electronic content management systems. Sorry, I couldn't resist with this picture. Almost every family with fewer kids than Mother Hubbard knows the problem with Costco is that the 64-ounce jug of ketchup is going to be awkward to use. It's going to take up a lot of room in the refrigerator, and it's probably going to go bad before you finish it. But the intuitive appeal and the long legacy of Henry Ford's production system with the emphasis on reducing unit costs is hard to suppress. And I bring this up. This is a driver for court. Everybody's looking at this. Well, it's cheaper. The more we have, divide it up more and more. Well, yeah, okay. There you go, cheaper ketchup. Help yourself. The core tenet of the Toyota production system, as well as its Western successors, which are lean manufacturing, Six Sigma. These, I can come up with a bunch of buzzwords, but they're really the process improvement stuff. Key concept is, and it came from Taiichi Ohno, inventory is the root of all evil. Waste due to inventory impacts courts particularly in the document management arena at both the front end of the processes, I'll call that supply inventory, and at the end of processes, which I'll call finished inventory. But first let's consider the front end impact, the supply inventory. If you recall our first diagram, in the classic auto factories, all the parts that would be needed, first of all, they're all shipped into the front end warehouses where they're stored. Then everything that's needed for a particular run gets shipped and stored nearby nearby the assembly line until they're needed. That way, a crate of screws, a truckload of drawers, and so forth would be on hand. The assembly line worker, when he needs a piece, he gets it, he uses it, uses the next one. The fewer trips needed to resupply the station, the better, because the lower the unit costs. At the Toyota plants, when the delegation took a look, the assembly stations, which were the things in the green box, were essentially the same. The axles got attached to the frames, the doors got attached to the bodies, and so on. But there weren't any extra parts sitting there at the stations. They didn't arrive until they were needed, hence the term just in time that I'm sure everybody's heard of. By developing and implementing technology and workflow, which, by the way, were technologies that were not available to Henry Ford. It's not that Henry Ford was stupid, he was brilliant. But he didn't have the technologies available that we do now. This is not easy to do, and it's, you've got to have the technologies and you've got to have an organizational commitment to doing it. But by developing and implementing that technology, Toyota automated the movement of the parts to their destinations when needed. So the space needed for each station was a lot less, and there were never any leftover or wasted parts that had to be moved again and possibly never used. In courts, stacks of paper and filing waiting to be processed constitute supply inventory. This, according to Jeff. Excuse me. It may seem simpler and more efficient to pile them up, process each, and move them from the inbox to the outbox. And let's face it, that's what people are used to doing. However, just as Toyota realized with its assembly line, the results are counterintuitive. The stacks take up valuable desk and workspace, and while items are in those stacks, they're not available for any other use, and processing them out of order requires shuffling through the stacks. But if using ECM with configurable workflow on the incoming end, the electronic document's available just in time, whenever the user's ready to process. So, for example, a judge can sign one or several documents whenever he or she is ready. Files in the court are available as cases are called. Court staff reviewing and processing documents can pull them up to their work queues when they're ready for them. Space is saved. Document and file availability are not compromised. Organization is easier, and there's no waste, the unnecessary pulling, transport, and refiling of unused and unneeded documents and files. Now, it's important to note here that electronic documents or files listed in a work queue aren't inventory, in the sense that they occupy no space, they require no movement, and they remain available to everyone else, even while they're queued up for processing. And on the other end, finished inventory is no less a target for eliminating waste. Some of the same psychology applies. It sure seems more efficient to keep a lot of finished inventory on hand and then move it in large batches. And it sure seems that you'd like inventory on hand in case a buyer came along. As it turns out, once again, the results are counterintuitive. Another shock for the Americans visiting Toyota came at the end of the assembly line. You don't see it here, this is the court thing, but all the way in the end, remember, it was a parking lot. In America, the finished vehicles rolled out of the assembly line onto a massive parking lot, and there they sat until they were shipped. The cars awaiting shipment constituted finished inventory, and the lot and the management of the cars on it consumed considerable resources translation cost, very expensive. At Toyota, the vehicles weren't produced until Toyota knew where they were going to be shipped. They didn't manufacture any vehicles that weren't already pre-sold, at least to dealers. And every vehicle, as it rolled off the assembly line, just rolled right onto a truck and off it went. There was no parking lot on the other end. So, you know, the dealers or direct buyers got their cars. They were actually brand new, not having sat on the factory lot for days, weeks, or months. Of course, at the end of the year, Toyota had a lot fewer unsold vehicles left, so their sales were never nearly as good at the end of the year. But anyway, the savings resulted in considerably less overhead cost per vehicle, which allowed them to sell for a lower price to the customers. Now consider how these same forces come into play with processed file documents and people in the court. After documents are processed, they're stacked into outgoing piles, which is, you know, finished inventory. They wait transport to the next step of processing. Thus, the first item processed doesn't go anywhere until the last item process is completed, because you're going to take them all out at the same time. In some cases, events will have moved ahead so that the previous document process is rendered moot, or even worse, has to be undone and redone. Think about a warrant for failure to appear signed by a judge that waits in an outbox during which time the subject of the warrant comes into court. People have their hearings completed. Then they've either got to wait or come back to pay, get their paperwork, get new dates, whatever it happens to be. Or how about a defendant who's been sentenced? We have this problem in Oregon. Defendant who's been sentenced but has to either hang around in court or a holding area or even be sent back to the county lockup pending completion of the paperwork necessary to get them to the appropriate corrections facility. And that's the equivalent of your parking lot. That is not zero cost. That is great cost right there. Once again, electronic content management with configurable workflow can eliminate the finished inventory. The processed electronic document is instantly routed to the next processing point or points, because it doesn't have to be sequential anymore, and is based on the business rules that are embedded in the workflow. There doesn't have to be any latency. When the judge e-signs the document, it can go on its way without waiting for the rest of the stack to be signed. The documentation can potentially beat the defendant to his destination. Oops, I forgot to. Okay, in the manufacturing context, motion refers to human bodily movement, turning, lifting, reaching and getting something, getting up and going to get something. In the court document management context, it means exactly the same thing. So why is motion a waste? Well, my brother, who's an engineer for a vehicle manufacturing company, tells a story that I think illustrates the point. In line production, in order to have more, be able to make different kinds of vehicle, a sedan and a coupe, you have to change the lineup, and it's called setup, where you change what happens on the line. And that setup process takes time, where you change each station around from one thing to another. Oh, shut up. So that setup time is of no value to the customer. You have to do it, but it's of no value. So the more time you take, the more waste there is. My brother's company was under a lot of financial pressure, and they took them about 4 hours to do their setup. And they heard that their Asian competitor was claiming they could do it in a half an hour. And they said, man, that's just not possible. What they did was they went ahead to film it. So you're going to film it, and that was going to prove that it couldn't be done. So they get the way my brother tells us is just hysterical. I can't do it. So, hey, you got everybody lined up, all ready to do this. And they got the managers with the stopwatches and all this. And they got the first run, and they do the last vehicle on the first run. They say, okay, go. And he starts the watch. And the guy the operator at the first thing turns to me and says, where's my work order? Well, the manager stops the clock. They get the work order, they give it to me. Got the work order. Okay, they start the clock again. He says, okay, I need the equipment I need the tools to reset the equipment to the station. Well, he stopped the clock again. They go get it. This goes on and on. So this they finally finish it up. It takes all afternoon to do this thing. But when they run the film, they got 45 minutes of film, because they stopped the clock for all the rest of this stuff. So the point is that the 45 minutes was the value-adding time. The rest of the afternoon's time and activities were pure waste. According to my brother, this didn't preclude a lot of managerial denial. That, well, of course we have to do this. But imagine the same type of thing in a court docket. Suppose we evaluated the time and effort, but as soon as the clerk has to reach for the next file and hand it to the judge, we stop the clock. And every time the clerk or judge has to search through a stack of documents or files, we stop the clock. Every time someone has to go up and get up and go find a document or file, we stop the clock. Well, doing this, we can easily cram 45 minutes of value-added court processing into an entire morning. Give it a try. Go ahead and watch the process in your court. Take a note of any time anyone moves to get a document or a file, or moves to be in a position to do something with a document or file, and ask yourself these questions. 1, why did the person move? 2, how long did it take? And 3, how many times does that person do it every day? And if you really want a number on it, ask what you're paying that person and multiply that time by their hourly wage. My guess is that after you do this drill a couple of times, you're going to start to understand what makes motion one of the big 7 of the wastes and why it applies to the courts in spades. Anyway, calling out the waste of waiting in courts seems like shooting fish in a barrel. Where's the challenge? We know we make people wait. Indeed, courts often make people wait to wait. We've got waiting rooms, sitting rooms, courtrooms, hallways, jury assembly rooms ad infinitum. True, Disneyland does the same thing, but it all seems so much more fun there. Heck, if the Red Cross treated blood donors the way that the courts treat prospective jurors, only people who truly enjoyed being stuck with needles would ever give blood. Be that as it may, that waiting is a waste for those who are doing the waiting is pretty obvious, but that's not why Taiichi Ohno classified waiting as one of the 7 wastes. Not to be callous about it, but if the organization, including a court, can get away with making other people wait at no cost to the organization, well, what's the harm? It doesn't come out of our budget. Of course, from a customer service standpoint, the answer is plenty. Courts have surpassed motor vehicles departments as the most notorious places for waiting. But quite apart from people, the frittering of whose time waiting is indeed an enormous waste. Whenever things that should be processed are not being processed, waste occurs. Waste that's costing your budgets money. In the manufacturing world, waste occurs whenever parts or raw materials to be assembled, processed, used, etc. are not being processed. That's those stacks waiting for the guy to reach over and grab them. In the court document management world, any document, file, or matter that's waiting for action generates waste. Court examples include documents awaiting signature, filings that trigger the need to schedule a matter, matters requiring review and or approval, matters requiring multi-step preparation, and on and on. One big waste is time, which it turns out really is money, which is why the most carefully watched court performance metrics are what? The case aging statistics. That's why. Other significant, if less obvious wastes include storage space for piles of documents and files, and the unavailability of the documents and files for other processes, causing more waiting, just to name a couple. The largest cause of this type of waiting generally results from some form of process discontinuity. Either the needed document is not available to process in a timely manner, you're still waiting for it, or the document or file, even though it's ready for processing, isn't forwarded to the next processing or action point in a timely manner. An associated source of waiting occurs when the document or file drops through the cracks or is either misrouted or lost at the bottom of somebody's outbox. One reason why courts that implement electronic content management with workflow find that process improvement ends up being the largest driver of savings is that configurable workflow's main purpose is to seamlessly and instantly route things that are ready for processing to the next appropriate place, to exactly who and where they need to be at exactly the right time, thus drastically reducing waiting. And as a bonus, the system will keep track of any subsequent waiting, and that'll give timely feedback to the person who's responsible for the activity or process so you can improve it. I'm trying to just scream through this because we don't have a lot of time. Overprocessing, for a lot of folks, overprocessing just doesn't have the same level of intuitively obvious wastefulness as most of the other wastes. It almost sounds too good to be true. I mean, if a little bit is good, more has got to be better, right? And does it really apply to courts anyway? The most frequently cited example from the manufacturing world is painting on a surface that's already covered up. So you paint on a surface, then you put two surfaces together, it's painted, that's waste. Well, courts don't do anything like that, do they? Well, guess what? Of course they do. The second most frequently cited example of overprocessing is maintaining both electronic and paper records. Welcome to the Department of Redundancy Department. We all know that maintaining dual systems is wasteful and expensive. Department of Redundancy Department loves the term wasteful and expensive. How expensive? Well, the Ottawa courts did an extensive study of the additional costs incurred just in having to print out documents for wetting signature and then scan them back into the ECMS and maintain a hard copy. And not surprising, the answer was that the cost virtually offset all of the otherwise substantial savings for the ECMS. Another classic example of the Department of Redundancy Department hard at work is checking someone else's work before performing the next process. As in, Tom prepares the file and sends it to Mary for scheduling. And Mary then reviews everything that Tom did to make sure it's really ready for scheduling and that nothing's happened in the intervening week since Tom sent it to her that would cause it to not be ready for scheduling. This particular example illustrates one major reason, again, why the introduction of configurable workflows so drastically slashes the time and cost in courts. Workflow constitutes a double win. The checking is built in, plus the time lag between steps is eliminated. Another type of overprocessing from the manufacturing sector is that when you think about it, courts regularly practice is touching more than once. For example, a document comes in. Is it touched by accounting or a receiving and then by a docketing person and then by a filing person? Again, with e-filing, with workflow, it can eliminate those subsequent multiple touching wastes, and particularly since they're all sequential and more. And there are court equivalents to painting on a surface that's covered up. When a trial court has to prepare and send a case record and file on appeal, generally somebody goes through and removes any extraneous documents that the appellate court doesn't want to see. ECM can eliminate this double touch on either or both ends. On the trial court end, the record can be constructed using business rules that govern what does and does not show up. That people want to see it. On the appellate, the receiving end, the ECM can easily provide views that keep the unwanted material out of sight, so there's no need to paint that covered surface. My favorite illustration of overproduction, it far predates the advent of computers, is from Disney's The Sorcerer's Apprentice. That's a piece from the 1939 classic Fantasia, which if you haven't seen it, you ought to, where Mickey Mouse, as the sorcerer's apprentice, brings a broom to life to haul water for him. The broom, being committed to performing its appointed task endlessly without regard for whether or not there's a need for or indeed any more room for water, keeps on bringing in more and more water until it's flooding the chamber. Overproduction run amok. Very simply, overproduction consists of making more than can be immediately consumed, processed, or shipped. In an easy to understand example from the auto manufacturing world, overproduction shows up in all those unsold cars on the lots. Court examples abound. Think about lines of people waiting after court to pick up papers, pay fines, and so forth. Or stacks of files prepped, waiting for processing. Or inboxes with documents waiting to be signed. Think of pre-numbered file folders, the unused portion of which have to either be discarded or relabeled when the period for which they were prepared is expired and they haven't been used. Other examples of overproduction endemic to courts abound. Prepping way more files for hearings than will actually be used is a favorite. And you know what? You can't even unintentionally, oh, how many people are going to fail to appear? You don't know. But you got to prep them all. Sending multiple notices of the same thing. Sending the same notice to one attorney who represents more than one party. Printing an entire file when only one or two documents are used. Last but not least, defects. Calling defects a waste seems sort of like calling trash garbage. I mean, of course defects are a waste. But in calling out defects as one of the 7 wastes, Ono went way past the obvious. Because first, the cost of defects vastly exceeds even the most extravagant common sense estimates. In manufacturing context that Ono was addressing, defects usually referred to parts that didn't meet specifications. In courts, the analogous situation would be a hearing that's held or an action that's taken, like setting a matter for trial, where an essential step was missed or incorrectly done previously. The most obvious waste results from the labor and materials required for the rework. Still, obviously, the less directly, lost chronological time cannot be regained. And the cost of finding the defects can range from minimal, if it's identified at the source, to enormous, if not discovered till the product is used. And this is the classic example of a recall of vehicles due to a defective 5-cent bolt. In courts, consider the cost of setting aside convictions as a result of a constitutionally defective document chain of custody. Oh yeah, we had this stop between the counter and the file room. We were leaving them in the coffee room. That's where we put all the files. What could possibly go wrong? There was actually a fairly major thing a couple of years ago in Detroit over this, with a lot of cases dismissed, as I understood it. Defects in court operations take all kinds of form. Misfiled documents, matters incorrectly calendared or not calendared at all, judgments and other documents incorrectly or not logged into the Register of Actions and or judgment documents, deadlines missed, and on and on. These things all have a cost, and a lot bigger cost than anybody gives them credit for. And when you notice it, and if you talk to, like, John Battles and folks after they did it, these things go away, and everybody after ECM comes in, and nobody ever really even was thinking about it, but gee, all of a sudden, these things went away, and it costs a lot less. I particularly love it not when I hear or read someone who advocates saving money by eliminating waste, which is a euphemism, of course, for, well, we'll tell all people to be more careful, and that won't cost us anything. Well, the truth is defects occur for some pretty common reasons. Each of the other 6 wastes provide fertile ground for producing defects. They're all good at that. Beyond that, non-standard operating procedures constitute one of the most common causes for defects. Personnel untrained in a particular process, as in someone filling in for the regular clerk. Temporal discontinuity. A process requires multiple documents. Some of them get there, some of them haven't gotten here yet. They arrive at different places at different times with different people. That opens up lots of room for defects. And an emphasis on, this is big for the courts, an emphasis on quantity, which is speed, rather than quality and accuracy. These are some of the most common underlying causes. Again, ECM with the configurable workflow and the analysis that goes with it can directly attack the root causes of defects as well as the other wastes, each of which helps produce defects. So as managers, consider defects to be a potential low-hanging fruit for some serious cost savings when migrating to ECM. I just wanted to very briefly return one time to our overview diagram, because the punchline is that the Toyota plants were assembling parts and producing similar products, but without or with greatly reduced transportation, inventory, motion, waiting, overprocessing, overproduction, and defects. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's lots and lots of material available on this subject, but this gives a somewhat visual hit of the kind of difference that could result from paying attention to where waste occurs. So, is that my I'm done message? And that's all, folks. Actually, that almost is all, because it's the journey. At one level, the 7 wastes give a vision of the promised land. Anybody who's there, let me know. Give me directions on how to get there. Because I really, you all know this. It's the journey. It's getting there. You think you're ever going to eliminate all waste? Ain't going to happen. Keep at it. But I do thank you. I have a little bit of time for questions if people want to come up, or we want to do it now. If you want, please get a hold of me. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about this. It is a good thing to do to go into courts, and we do this sometimes to go in and do an analysis against these 7 wastes, just to identify areas of opportunity. So thank you very much.